Welcome back to our panel discussion, American Readiness, Technological Innovation in Energy and Fuel, sponsored by Honeywell, here on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. Our guest today, Roberto Guerrero, is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Operational Energy. Joseph Bryan is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy. The Honorable Catherine Hammack is the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installations, Energy, and the Environment. Mark Carell is Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Environment, Safety, and Infrastructure. And Carrie Smith, President of the Defense and Space Strategic Business Unit of Honeywell Aerospace. And before the break, we were talking about fuels that go into things that burn it. Let's talk about the things that burn it a little bit. Engines. Honeywell supplies engines. All of the vehicles and platforms use engines. In fact, even in process areas, generators, that's an engine also. And so what are some of the interesting things happening with respect to engines that save energy or use less of it?
So what we've seen in the Air Force is that, we have aircraft that have long lives. They stick around for quite a while. So sometimes we can take an engine, like on the KC-135 tanker, upgrade the internal components to that engine and get maybe a 1% to 2% fuel increase, fuel efficiency increase. And when you're talking fuel burn in the billions, that can be a big number, right? On the C5M Galaxy, we actually re-engined the C5M along with some other improvements, resulting in a 22% increase in thrust, 30% shorter takeoff roll, 55% faster climb rate, which means you get up to altitude where the air is thin, you can go much farther. That's really revolutionized some of the way we do missions, because now we can take the same amount of cargo extremely farther. Instead of having to stop in Hawaii, you can make it all the way to Japan from the California coast, which really enhances our ability to respond to something quickly with the right equipment. And then on the leading edge of that,
it's almost like getting a new plane.
It is. It makes a big difference, and it really made our operational planners look at what the current plans were and modify them to take advantage of this enhanced capability. The Air Force has made a very big investment on looking at adaptive engine technology. And what we're talking about there is you have fighter engines that have low bypass, which means a lot of the air coming into the engine comes right back out the engine through the burner can, and then you have bigger cargo planes, the planes the airlines fly are considered high bypass engines, and what the Air Force is concentrating on is a hybrid of the two. It's called adaptive engine technology. We have a program out that we're spending about $2 billion in the next 5 years to optimize this adaptive engine technology, and what that will do is it'll allow our fighters to fly on an engine that produces burns on about 25% less fuel. Gets us about a 30% increase in range, gets us about a 10% increase in thrust, and also adds some thermal management capabilities as well. And the reason the thermal management piece is important is that some of these aircraft have a lot of electronics and other things that require cooling. Adding that piece as well allows us to put on 21st technology, 21st century tools, weapons that we might have been limited on before with the legacy engines that we have.
And that sounds like something that could be shared across all of the services.
Well, one of the things that Roberto mentioned is we have frames, whether it's Black Hawk helicopters or Apache helicopters or tanks, that are very good frames. And when we can upgrade the insides with new engines, new auxiliary power units, or new technologies, we can make that same equipment much more efficient. And it also reduces the cost for the upgrade. So the Army's doing the same thing with a program to upgrade our engines and our helicopters. They can fly twice as far, carry twice the load, and use less energy at the same time.
All right, and
one of the most interesting things we're doing on engines is it has to do with the hybrid electric drive, which is a drive that we're installing on our guided missile destroyers. The first one will go in this fall, and we'll be putting in about 19 of them over the next several years. And what it does is, some folks have called it sort of a Prius type thing. There's lots of times when a ship needs to go fast and needs pedal to the metal, all its engines need to be online, but there's lots of times when a ship doesn't need to go fast, when it's on station, when it's circulating on station to do its mission. And so what the hybrid electric drive allows a ship to do is use its full engine throttle, full propulsion system to go fast when it needs to, but switch to a hybrid electric drive when it only needs to go slow. And what that does, again, why we're doing it, is because it adds capability. It allows that ship to stay on station, stay on mission longer between refuelings. So we're putting these in our And our guided missile destroyers are already in a couple of large deck amphibious ships, and they've shown tremendous capability improvements. The other thing we're working with the Army on some of our mobile hybrid electric systems, where we're combining batteries and solar panels with traditional diesel generators and very advanced controls to reduce the time that a diesel generator has to run and reduce the fuel that it requires to support it forward. And that's a really important program for our forward deployed forces, because again, we want to take those fuel trucks off the road. We'd like to be silent when we can, because that's helpful when we're dealing with hostile territory. And so that's a program where we're working together with the Army and the Marines to improve the engines that we're deploying forward. So those couple of things are just a couple examples of the things we have going on.
And Carrie, what about engines in Jeeps and trucks and that kind of thing?
Honeywell's one of the leading providers to all the services in the military for engines, and specifically energy efficient turbine engines. And so we provide engines for everything from M1 tanks to the MQ-9 Reaper unmanned air vehicle, as well as the Chinooks. One of the programs I'll pick up on that Catherine mentioned that's very important to us is called the Improved Turbine Engine Program, which is going to replace the engines across all the Blackhawks as well as the Apache helicopters going forward. And we're in a 50-50 partnership joint venture with Pratt & Whitney to pursue that effort. What's important is that it's going to achieve 25% fuel efficiency savings, which is substantial. And also, I'll capitalize on something Roberto mentioned. These platforms are around for a long, long time. So if you look at the Chinook, it's been the workhorse forever. Our T55 engine is key to that platform and its success, but it does require some upgrades. So we're currently involved in an improved engine performance program, and that program will realize 27% improvement in power as well as 8% in fuel efficiency. And then, Tom, you mentioned the turbochargers. Those are important as well. We're proud to be a part of the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle with our turbocharger technology.
And that one's starting to really get into the production stage, correct?
Yes, it's just starting up, and we're looking forward to that going full steam ahead.
Because there still are diesel engines and there's alternative fuel in that branch of fuel consumption too, correct?
Yes.
All right.
We still have equipment from the 1970s and 1980s. You know, some of our Jeeps or some of our Humvees haven't traveled that far. So the equipment's still good, but the technology could use improvements. And so we're upgrading them because the equipment's still basically good.
Well, that's too late for the checker taxi, I guess. Might have been saved if we'd had those things a while ago. And I want to return to something fundamental that we just touched on earlier in the discussion, and that is the generating capability at base or installation and the microgrid that goes with it. And that sounds like something easy to say, but really hard to do given how reliable the utility grid, the big grid, has been for so many decades. And so, Mark, why don't you start on going into depth a little bit about what's going on there?
Sure, thanks. So although the grid is very reliable, today's threat from a cyber standpoint, from a physical standpoint, as well as a historic weather standpoint means we have to be able to be separated from the grid for an extended period of time and operate. So that means two big things for the Air Force, because installation is crucial to us. One is we've got to be able to have energy that's available to us no matter what, which means on-site distributed generation. Renewables are crucial to that. So we talk about our holistic policy being about clean, and it is, but renewables are inherently good for our ability to go the long haul. Why? It doesn't have a supply line. The sun is going to be there, geothermal is going to be there, the wind is going to be there. Certainly there are storage and intermittency issues we need to deal with, but it's a great source of a way for us to provide power. Once we have that power, though, you've got to be able to do something with it. And frankly, from a cybersecure standpoint and with the kind of agility we need in a microgrid, it isn't all there yet in technology. So one of the things the Air Force has is its Renewable Energy Demonstration Initiative. 2 projects underway, one in Hawaii, but one that we're just starting at Beale Air Force Base in California, that's intended to look at that, to specifically look at where are the crucial mission power requirements, and then to build a microgrid that's going to be agile enough to move the power where it needs to be on a real-time basis from this renewable energy source, from this distributed energy source, so that we can accomplish that mission. Once we do that, we'll try to export that to the rest of our installations.
And is this something that, who builds these microgrids?
So right now, At Beale, we've just gone out with a request for information, so we went out broad area to a number of different companies and said, this is what we're looking for. And, well, I won't say companies, we went out broadly and said, companies come to us. This is what we're looking for. Tell us how you might be able to do that. So our expectation is, and in fact we've gotten a large response to it, that companies like Honeywell, other ESCOs are going to come back and go, well, this is what you want. Here's how we can make that happen for you. And it kind of goes to what you asked earlier, which is, where do you get this expertise? And we go out to the people who have it.
Okay. And is this the same case that's happening on the other buildings or buildings?
So I think Mark's right about the threats to our installation electricity performance. So the cyber threat is obviously widely discussed, widely reported on. I think utilities are acknowledged to be vulnerable to threats, just as many segments of the economy are. The Navy happens to exist on coasts for obvious reasons. Our bases are mostly along the waterline, and so as we think about things like increased storm activity and sea level rise, that's going to challenge our electrical grid. I think there was a study out recently that said in the Norfolk area, a Category 3 hurricane hitting Norfolk would put about 9 of 11 major substations underwater in Norfolk, and 15 or 12 of 18 in the greater Hampton Roads area would be underwater. That's a challenge for Norfolk Naval Station. It's a challenge for the capability that station provides. So the idea that we want to be more reliable and resilient and bring power inside our fence line is important for our operations. So we're doing a lot. We're one example, Marine Corps Air Station Yuma. We're have reached an agreement for a 25 megawatt peaker plant inside the fence line, working with our utility partners to provide secure energy to the installation and some microgrid capability. We're working with this up in New London. We're working with the city of Groton and the state of Connecticut to not only focus on resiliency and reliability of the grid inside the fence line, but to work on community resiliency, to make sure that necessary functions outside the fence can also get power in the event of a cyber emergency or a weather emergency, because the fact is a lot of our folks live off base, and a lot of the services we're going to rely on to get people to work exist off base. So we have to think regionally in addition to thinking inside our fence line. That's something we're really working hard to do.
We also have a FEMA responsibility on many of our bases. So a responsibility to ensure that we can restore activity. And so we have worked on resiliency, and one of our bases, Fort Drum in upstate New York, converted an old coal-fired plant to biomass. And so it's burning clippings from the timber industry and good forestry management. It smells like a wood fire out there, which is pretty good smell as long as you know there's nothing burning that shouldn't be. But we tested disconnecting from the grid. We simulated the power grid going down, and we had the ability to completely run the base disconnected from the grid. And not that we're going to run that way in 24 hours a day, but should the grid go down, or should there be a natural disaster or a national event, we have the ability to disconnect and still continue our primary mission. And so we've done that at a couple of our bases. But talking, like Mark mentioned, about microgrids, we then want the ability to move energy around the base, knowing where it goes and who's using it, and that's got to be a critical load. So we need a smart grid infrastructure. So many of our bases are World War II relics, and they have the same wiring and distribution from that era. So it does require quite an upgrade to our bases.
Carrie, what is the trend in this? Are microgrids isolated totally, or do you find that a lot of customers, when necessary, can feed back to the main grid from the microgrid they've built?
Yes, it can be either way, and we're heavily involved in microgrid technology, and I also say we're involved in cybersecurity protection as well for systems and utilities, industrial power plants. But today we're servicing, for example, the Pacific Missile Test Center for the Navy. We're at Wheeler Air Force Base in Hawaii. We're also helping at Fort Bragg with microgrid technology there. And again, on the cybersecurity side, how do we protect against cyber threats and making sure that we put up resilient infrastructures?
So it sounds like there's learning happening in these microgrid and resiliency and self-sufficiency efforts that could really translate back to the big grid, which is grappling with aging and cybersecurity problems and a host of other issues.
Exactly, very similar problems. How do you make it more efficient? How do you manage consumption? How do you manage generators? How do you do everything more effectively?
I wonder, if down the line, could there be a defense grid? I mean, is there a way of connecting microgrids transcontinentally or across state lines? Or
Well, we're doing some of that in Hawaii, because if you look at the island of Oahu, all power generation is on the shoreline in an area that could be susceptible to tsunamis. And so is Honolulu International Airport. So the question is, if a tsunami or a big hurricane or typhoon hit the islands, how would you restore power to Oahu? So what we're doing is partnering with Hawaii Electric to build a power plant on an Army base that's one of the highest altitudes. 830 feet doesn't sound like it's very tall, but in Hawaii it is. And that power plant that the utility is putting in there is going to power an Army base, it's going to power an airfield, and it's going to power a community hospital. So during a non-emergency time, it's going to be part of the community. But during an emergency time, the microgrid there is going to help restore the bases and the community and all emergency services.
And that's a good place to end the discussion on, thinking about the beautiful shores of Hawaii. I want to thank our guest today. The Honorable Catherine Hammock is the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Installations, Energy, and Environment. Mark Carell is Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Environment, Safety, and Infrastructure. Roberto Guerrero is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Operational Energy. Joseph Bryan is Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Energy. And Carrie Smith is the President of Defense and Space Strategic Business Unit of Honeywell Aerospace. I'm Tom Temin, Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsradio.com. Use the search term Honeywell.
On behalf of Honeywell, thank you for joining us. A link to the archive session will be sent to you shortly. If you requested a training certificate, you will also receive an email with download instructions after the webinar. This concludes our discussion. Thank you.